July evening in 1913, two women of St. Louis sat with a Ouija board upon their knees. Some time before this, a friend had aroused their interest in this unfathomable toy, and they had since whiled away many an hour with the inscrutable meanderings of the heart-shaped pointer. But like thousands of others who had played with the instrument, they had found it, up to this date, but little more than a source of amused wonder. The messages which they had laboriously spelled out were only such as might have come from the subconsciousness of either one or the other, or at least were no more strange than the innumerable communications which have been received through the reading of the Ouija board. But upon this night they received a visitor. The pointer suddenly became endowed with an unusual agility, and with great rapidity presented this introduction. Many moons ago I lived. Again I come. Patience Worth my name. The women gazed round-eyed at each other, and the board continued. Wait, I would speak with thee, if thou shalt live, and so shall I, and I make my bread by thy hearth. Good friends, let us be merry. The time for work is past. Let the tabby drowse and blink her wisdom to the firelog. How quaint that is, one of the women exclaimed. Good Mother Wisdom is too harsh for thee, said the board, and thou should love her only as a foster mother. Thus began an intimate association with Patience Worth that still continues, in a series of communications that in intellectual vigor and literary quality are virtually without precedent in the scant imaginative literature quoted in the chronicles of psychic phenomena. The personality of Patience Worth, if personality it may be called, so impressed itself upon these women at the first visit that they got pencil and paper and put down not only all that she transmitted through the board, but all the questions and comment that elicited her remarks, and at every meeting since then a verbatim record has been made of the conversations and the communications. These records have accumulated until they have filled several volumes of typewritten pages, and upon them, and upon the writer's personal observations of the workings of the phenomena, this narrative is based. They include conversations, maxims, epigrams, allegories, tales, dramas, poems, all the way from sportive to religious, and even prayers, most of them of no little beauty, and of a character that may reasonably be considered unique in literature. The women referred to are Mrs. John H. Curran, wife of the former Immigration Commissioner of Missouri, and Mrs. Emily Grant Hutchings, wife of the Secretary of the Tower Grove Park Board in St. Louis, both ladies of culture and refinement. Mrs. Curran is a young woman of nervous temperament, bright, vivacious, ready of speech. She has a taste for literature, but is not a writer, and has never attempted to write anything more ambitious than a personal letter. Mrs. Hutchings, on the other hand, is a professional writer of skill, and it was her quick appreciation of the quality of the communications that the starting of the record is due. It was soon apparent, however, that it was Mrs. Curran who was the sole agent of transmission, for the communications came only when she was at the board, and it mattered not who else sat with her. During the first months, only Mrs. Curran and Mrs. Hutchings sat, but gradually the circle widened and others assisted Mrs. Curran. Sometimes as many as 5 or 6 would sit with her in the course of an evening. Mr. Curran has acted as amanuensis, Curran's and recorded the communications at most of the sittings. Mrs. Curran's mother, Mrs. Mary E. Pollard, occasionally taking his place. The Ouija board is a rectangular piece of wood about 16 inches wide by 24 inches in length and half an inch thick. Upon it, the letters of the alphabet are arranged in 2 concentric arcs with 10 numerals below, and the words yes and no at the upper corners. The planchette or pointer is a thin, heart-shaped piece of wood that has 3 legs upon which it moves about upon the board, its point indicating the letters of the words it is spelling. 2 persons are necessary for its operation. They place the tips of their fingers lightly upon the pointer and wait. Perhaps it moves, perhaps it does not. Sometimes it moves aimlessly about the board, spelling nothing. Sometimes it spells words, but is unable to form a sentence. But often it responds readily enough to the impulses which control it, and even answers questions intelligibly, occasionally in a way that excites the wonder and even the awe of those about it. Its powers have been attributed by some to supernatural influence, by others to subconsciousness, but science has looked upon it with disdain, as until recent years science has looked upon nearly all unprecedented phenomena. Mr. W.T. Carrington, an eminent English investigator of psychical phenomena, and in his exhaustive work on the subject has this to say of the Ouija board. Granting for the sake of argument that the board is moved by the sitter, either consciously or unconsciously, the great and vital question still remains. What is the intelligence behind the board that directs the phenomena? Whoever sets out to give a final and decisive answer to this question in the present state of our knowledge will have his task cut out for him, and I wish him happiness in the undertaking. Personally, I am attempting nothing of the kind. The Ouija board has been in use for many years. There's no element of novelty in the mere fact that curious and puzzling messages are received by means of it. I emphasize this fact because I wish to place the board in its proper relation to the communications from the intelligence calling herself Patience Worth. Aside from the psychical problem involved, and which, so far as the board is concerned, is the same in this case as in many others, the Ouija board has no more significance than a pen or a pencil in the hand. It is merely an instrument for the transmission of thought in words. In comparison with the personality and the literature which it reveals in this instance, it is a factor of little significance. It is proper to say, however, at this point, that every word attributed to Patience Worth in this volume was received by Mrs. Curran through this instrument. Before considering these communications in detail, it would be well for the reader to become a little better acquainted with the alleged Patience herself. Patience, as a rule, speaks an archaic tongue that is in general the English language of about the time of the Stuarts, but which contains elements of a usage still more ancient, and not rarely word and phrase forms that seem never to have been used in English or in any English dialect. Almost all of her words, however, whether in conversation or in literary composition, are of pure Anglo-Saxon Norman origin. There is seldom a word of direct Latin or Greek parentage. Virtually all of the objects she refers to are things that existed in the 17th century or earlier. In all of the great mass of manuscript that has come from her, we have not noticed a single reference to an object of modern creation or development, nor have more than a dozen words been found in her writings that may be of later origin than the 17th century, and some of these words are debatable. She is shown in what would seem to be a genuinely feminine spirit of perversity, that she can use a modern word if she chooses to do so. And if she is living now, no matter when she was on Earth, why should she not? She has twice used the word shack, meaning a roughly constructed cabin, a word which is in that sense so new and so local that it has but recently found a place in the dictionaries. But the fact remains that the number of such words is so small as to be negligible. Only one who has tried to write in archaic English without committing anachronisms can realize its tremendous difficulty. We are so saturated with words and idioms of modern origin that it's almost impossible wholly to discard them, even when given every advantage of time and reflection. So, how much more difficult must it be then to use and maintain such language without an error in ordinary impromptu conversation, answering questions that could not have been expected, and flashing repartee that is entirely dependent upon the situation or remarks of the moment. Yet Patience does this with marvelous facility, so she can hardly be Mrs. Curran. All of her knowledge of material things seems to be drawn from English associations. She's surprisingly familiar with the trees and flowers, the birds and beasts of England. She knows the manners and customs of its people as they were 2 or 3 centuries ago, the people of the fields or the people of the palace. Her speech is filled with references to the furniture, utensils, and mechanical contrivances of the household of that time, and to its articles of dress, musical instruments, and tools of agriculture, and the mechanical arts. There are also a few indications of a knowledge of New England life, yet she has never admitted a residence in England or New England, has never spoken of a birthplace or an abiding place anywhere, has never, in fact, used a single geographical proper name in relation to herself. The communications of Patience Worth come in a variety of forms. Conversation that is strewn with wit and wisdom, epigrams and maxims, poems by the 100, parables and allegories, stories of a semi-dramatic character, and dramas. Here's an example of her conversation from one of the early records. An evening when a skeptical friend, a young physician, somewhat disposed to the use of slang, was present with his wife. As the ladies took the board, the doctor remarked, "I hope Patience Worth will come. I'd like to find out what her game is." Patience was there and instantly responded, "Dost thou, dost then, desire the plucking of another goose?" And the doctor said, "By George, she's right there with the grease, isn't she? Enough to baste the last upon the spit. Well, that's quick wit for you. Pretty hard to catch her." Patience said, "The salt of today will not serve to catch the bird of tomorrow." "She'd better call herself the bird of yesterday," the doctor said. "I wonder what kind of a mind she had anyway." Patience replied, "Dost crave to taste the sauce?" The doctor said, "She holds to her simile of the goose. I wish you'd ask her how she makes that little table move under your hands to spell the words." Patience replied, "A wise cook telleth not the brew." "Turn that board over and let me see what's under it," the doctor said. This was done, and after his inspection it was reversed. "They'll bump thy nose to look within the hopper." "Whew, she doesn't mind handing you one, does she?" Mrs. Pollard said, "That's Patience's way. She doesn't think we count for anything." "The bell cow doth deem the good folk to go to Sabbath house from the ringing of her bell." "She evidently thinks we are a conceited lot. Well, I believe she'll agree with me that you can't get far in this world without a fair opinion of yourself." "So the donkey loveth his bray," Patience said. The doctor's wife replied, "You can draw her on all you please. I'm going to keep perfectly still." "Oh, even the mouse will have a nibble," Patience replied. "There, she isn't going to let you off without a little roast. I wonder what she has to say to you." Didst ever see the brood hen puff up with self-esteem when all her chicks go for a swim? "Let's analyze that and see if there's anything in it," the doctor said. "Strain the potion, mayhap thou wilt find a fly," Patience answered. This will be sufficient to illustrate Patience's form of speech and her ready wit. It also shows something of the character of the people to whom and through whom she is usually spoken. They are not solemn investigators nor pussy-footed charlatans. There's no ceremony about the sitting, no dimmed lights, no compelled silences, no mummeries of any sort. The assistance is of the ordinary, fun-loving, somewhat irreverent American type. The board is brought into the living room under the full glare of the electric lamps. The men perhaps smoke their cigars. If Patience seems to be in the humor for conversation, all may take part, and she hurls her javelins impartially. A visitor is at once brought within the umbra of her wit. Her conversation, as already indicated, is filled with epigrams and maxims. A book could be made from these alone. They are, of course, not always original. What maxims are? But they are given on the instant, without possibility of previous thought, and are always to the point. Here are a few of these prompt aphorisms. "A lollipop is but a breeder of pain. An old goose gobbles the grain like a gosling. Dead resolves are sorry fare. The goose knoweth where the bin leaketh. Quills of sages were plucked from geese. Puddings fit for lords would sour the belly of the swine boy. To clap the cover on a steaming pot of herbs will but modify the stench. She who quacketh loudest deems the gander not the lead at waddling time. Climb not the stars to find a pebble. He who hath a house, a hearth, and a friend hath the lucky lot." She's also caustic and incisive. "A drink of ass's milk would nurture the swine, but wouldst thou then expect his song to change from want, want, want? Some folk, like the bell without a clapper, go clanging on in a good faith, believing the good folk can hear them." Aside from the dramatic compositions, some of which are of great length, most of the communications received from Patience have been in verse. There is rarely a rhyme, practically all being iambic blank verse in lines of irregular length. The rhythm is almost uniformly smooth. At some sittings, the poetry begins to come as soon as the hands are placed upon the planchette, and the evening is given over to the production of verse. At others, verses are mingled with repartee and epigram, but seldom is an evening spent without at least one poem coming. This was not the case in the earlier months, when many sittings were given up wholly to conversation. The poetry has gradually increased in volume, as if the earlier efforts of the influence had been tentative, while the responsiveness of the intermediary was being tested. So too the earlier verses were fragments. Such fragments, however, were but steps leading to larger things. And then, some 6 months after her first visit, came the poem which follows, and which may be considered the real beginning of her larger works. Long lines of leaden cloud as the purple sea, white gulls skimming across the spray, O dissonant cry, art thou the death cry of desire? Ah, wail, ye winds, and search ye for my dearest wish, along the rugged coast and down, where purling waters whisper to the rosy coral reef. Ah, search, and when ye return, bring ye the answering. Do I stand and call unto the sea for answer? Ah, wisdom, where art thou? A gull but shows thee to the southland, and leaden sky but warneth thee of storm. And wind, thou art but a changeling, so shall I call to thee? Not so. I build not upon the spray, and seek not within the smaller world, for God dwelleth not abroad, but deep within. There is a spiritual significance more or less profound in nearly all of the poems. Some of the lines are obscure, but study reveals a meaning, and the more I, at least, study them, the more I've been impressed with the intellectual power behind them. It is this that makes these communications seem to stand alone among the numerous messages that are alleged to have come from that undiscovered country. An intense love of nature is expressed in most of the communications, whether in prose or verse, and also a wide knowledge of nature, but not the knowledge of the scientist, but that of the poet. There is something more than liquid sweetness in its lines. There's truth, deeper wisdom, and a lore more profound and more mystical are revealed or delicately concealed in some of the others. It's not my purpose to attempt an extended interpretation of the metaphysics of these poems. This one will repay real study. No doubt there will be varied views of its meaning, of the poem's meaning. These poems do not all move with the murmuring ripple of running brooks. Some of them appalling in the rugged strength of their figures of speech are like the storm waves, smashing their sides against the cliffs. In my opinion, there are not many in literature that grip the mind with greater force than the first two lines of the brief one which follows, and there are few things more beautiful than its conclusion. Ah, God, I have drunk unto the dregs, and flung the cup at thee. The dust of crumpled righteousness hath dried and soaked unto itself. E'en the drop I spilled to Bacchus, whilst thou, all patient, sendest purple vintage for a later harvest. The poems sometimes contain irony, gentle as a summer zephyr, or crushing as a mailed fist. She touches all the strings of human emotion and frequently thrums the note of sorrow, usually, however, as an overture to a paean of joy. The somber tones in her pictures, to use another metaphor, are used mainly to strengthen the highlights. But now and then, there comes a verse of sadness, such as this one, which is not wholly sad. Ah, wake me not, for should my dreaming work a spell to soothe my troubled soul, wouldst thou deny me dreams? Ah, wake me not. Among the leaves wherein the shadows lurk, I fancy conjured faces of my loved, long lost. And if the clouds to me are sorrow's shroud, and if I trick my sorrow, then to hide beneath a smile, or build of wasted words a key to wisdom's door, wouldst thou deny me? Oh, let me dream. The day may bring fresh sorrows, but the night will dreams. When this poem was spelled upon the board, its pathos affected Mrs. Curran to tears, and to comfort her, Patience quickly applied an antidote in the following jingle, which illustrates not only her versatility but her sense of humor. Patter, patter, briny drops on my kerchief drying. Spatter, spatter, salty stream down my poor cheeks flying. Brine enough to immerse a ham, salt enough to build a dam. Trickle, trickle, all ye can, and wet my dry heart's aching. Sop and sop, 'tis better so, for in dry soil flowers never grow. This little jingle answered its purpose. Mrs. Curran's tears continued to fall, but they were tears of laughter, and all the little party about the board were put in good spirits. These examples will serve to illustrate the nature of the communications and as an introduction to the numerous compositions that will be presented in the course of this narrative. The question now arises, or more likely, it has been in the reader's mind since the book was opened. What evidence is there of their genuineness? Does Mrs. Curran consciously or subconsciously produce this matter? It is hardly credible that anyone able to write such poems would bother with a Ouija board to do it. It will probably be quite evident to a reader of the whole matter that whoever or whatever it is that writes this poetry possesses an already intimated, not only an unusual mind, but an unusual knowledge of archaic forms of English, a close acquaintance with nature as it is found in England, and a familiarity with the manners and customs of English life of an older time. Many of the words that are used are obscure dialectical forms not to be found in any work of literature. All the birds and flowers and trees referred to in the communications are native to England, with few exceptions that indicate some knowledge of New England. No one not growing up with the language used could have acquired facility in it without years of patient study. No one could become so familiar with English nature without long residence in England. For the knowledge revealed is not of the character that can be obtained from books. Mrs. Curran has had none of these experiences. She's never been in England. Her studies since leaving school have been confined to music, to which art she is passionately attached, in which she is adept. She has never been a student of literature, ancient or modern, and has never attempted any form of literary work. She has no particular interest in English history, English literature, or English life, but it may be urged this matter might be produced subconsciously from Mrs. Curran's mind or from the mind of some person associated with her. The phenomena of subconsciousness are many and varied, and the word is used to indicate but does not explain numerous mysteries of the mind, which seem wholly baffling despite this verbal hitching post. But I have no desire to enter into an argument. My sole purpose is so to present the facts that the reader may intelligently form their own opinion. Here are the facts that relate to this phase of the subject. Mrs. Curran does not go into a trance when the communications are received. On the contrary, her mind is absolutely normal, and she may talk to others while the board is in operation under her hands. It is unaffected by conversation in the room. There's no effort at mental concentration. Aside from Mrs. Curran, it does not matter who's present or who sits at the board with her. There are seldom the same persons at any two successive sittings, yet the personality of Patience is constant and unvarying. As to subconscious action on the part of Mrs. Curran, it would seem to be sufficient to say that no one can impart knowledge subconsciously unless it has been first acquired through the media of consciousness. That is to say, through the senses. No one, for example, who had never seen or heard a word of Chinese could possibly speak the language subconsciously. One may unconsciously acquire information, but it must be through the senses. It remains but to add that the reputations and social position of the Currans put them above the suspicion of fraud. If fraud were at all possible in such a matter as this, that Mrs. Curran does not give public exhibitions, nor private exhibitions for pay, that the compositions have been received in the presence of their friends, or of friends of their friends, all specially invited guests. There seems nothing abnormal about her. She's an intelligent, conscientious woman, a member of the Episcopalian Church, not especially zealous in the affairs of religion, a talented musician, a clever and witty conversationalist, and a charming hostess. These facts are stated not as gratuitous compliments, but as evidences of character and temperament which have a bearing upon the question.